بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحابته أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. أصبحنا وأصبح الملك لله رب العالمين. اللهم إنا نسألك خير هذا اليوم فتحه ونصره ونوره وبركته وهداه، ونعوذ بك من شره وشر ما فيه وشر ما قبله وشر ما بعده. اللهم زدنا ولا تنقصنا وأكرمنا ولا تهنا وأعطنا ولا تحرمنا وآثرنا ولا تؤثر علينا وارض عنا، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت عليم حكيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah. Today we plan to cover the section from Tafsir al-Turaqat entitled Bab al-Mujmal wal-Mubayyan, chapter concerning the summary and the detailed. And of course, before that, as I like to make a custom, is to, again, just to have a brief overview of where we've sort of come this far. And this particular science, it deals with the sources and the ways of interacting with the sources. Or we can say that usul al-fiqh, fundamentally, it deals with the philosophical foundations for the authority of the different sources of Islam, and then also the parameters of language, which help us to deduce from those particular sources, those scriptural sources in particular, what might be the particular judgment which accords with the divine will. Shukran. So for that reason, up to this point, or at least we'll say over most of these particular lessons, the author has been dealing with things pertaining to the language, or different constructs of language, different types of words, different types of sentences, the different types of expressions or different uses of expressions. And in particular, when we talk about uses, you're talking about what is often referred to as literal application or usage and figurative application or usage. So for instance, when we studied al-awamir and nawahi, the commandments and prohibitions, that we learned that commandments have many different implications. They imply more than one thing. Not to say that they imply more than one thing at the same time, but rather that when we come across a commandment, that there is a presumption that this particular commandment is either, we say, indicative of an obligation or indicative of a recommendation, with respect to the individual being ordered by one of a higher authority who is ordering us. But at the same time, the commandments also could simply imply the general permissibility of something. They can be utilized as rhetorical devices, such as in Arabic we call it taswiya, the idea of equality in terms of the performance or omission of a particular action. Like in one verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's speaking to those who end up in the hellfire, and he said, "Isbiru o la tasbiru, sawa'un Alaikum." Be patient or don't be patient. That in itself is a commandment, but it is not to imply that the individuals truly can actually fulfill that commandment. It says, be patient or don't be patient. It's the same, in either case. So that sometimes that is what happens. Sometimes a commandment is an indirect threat itself. We call it tahdeed, like in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that إِذَا لَمْ تَسْتَحِي فَاصْنَعْ مَا شِئْتَ, that if you have no shame, do whatever you want. Do whatever you like. If you have no shame, do whatever you want. And many of the scholars, they say, well, that in itself implies it's sort of an indirect threat. And sort of to Kaf, Allah talks about فَمَنْ شَاءَ مِنْكُمْ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ, that whoever wants to, believe. Whoever doesn't want to, reject faith. All right. But then after that, it says, "Inna a'tadna lidhalimina naran ahata bihim saradiquha." But we have prepared for the wrongdoers a fire, right, whose encirclement will encompass them. So at any rate, you find these different types of expressions. So when a word, like we say a particular construct, like a commandment, if we accept that it has an original indication or has we call a literal indication, either being indicative of an obligation or a recommendation, as is the popular view of Imam Shafi'i, that it was indicative of a recommendation, where the majority of the scholars say it's indicative or the presumptive judgment or indication of a commandment is that the action is an obligation. Whatever position we take, that we'll say that is the original or literal meaning or connotation of a commandment, and then when it's not being utilized in that original connotation or context, then we say that it is a figurative application of a commandment. So if I say to Allah, Allahumma a'atini khayran, so Allah give me good, right? It's a commandment, but does he have to do it? No. It's a figurative or metaphorical application or use of a commandment. And the same thing with prohibitions. So if you say prohibition, if one person is being discouraged from doing something, and that particular discouragement either is indicative of obligation or recommendation, just as in the case of the commandment, same thing. We'll say that obligation or recommendation are the original connotations or the literal meaning of those particular constructs. So when we go from commandments, then we go from what we call the prescriptive expressions, and then move on to descriptive expressions. We run into this similar sort of situation. So when we talk about am and khas, that a general expression, that it is whatever includes two or more things. It is a universal category, a word which is indicative of the itself collects a number of particulars of like character or personality underneath its particular designation. And so when we use a general expression, but we don't mean it to be all-inclusive, then we're saying we're utilizing a general expression in a figurative fashion, right? But when we utilize it literally, right, that inna Allah yuhibbul muhsinin, inna Allah yuhibbul muqsitin, that Allah, He loves those who do good, Allah loves those who are just. When we use it in its literal sense, it means everybody. Allah loves all those who do good. Allah loves all those who are just and fair, right? So that's a literal application or usage of the word. But in the cases typically in fiqh, most of the times a general expression is a metaphorical usage of the general. It always excludes someone or something, right, from the generality of that particular expression, right? And so that is important to begin with. And so when we come into the mushmal and mubayyan, also as well, that there's a type of expression, right, that we place it under a literal sort of usage of that expression, and then also a figurative use of for that particular expression. At any rate, what's important, I think, from this in context or in line with the actual title of this course, in understanding the roots of interpretative disagreements, is for us to understand that often disagreements really originate from the disagreement over the definition of things. That often people disagree about the definition of things, and that is a fundamental cause of the differences, the disagreements about the judgments that they make about different categories of things. So that's important to keep in mind. And in some regards, we can say that a significant number, if not most, disagreements often originate from this. Like, say, for instance, as I brought up before, that Muslim for Muslim, right, means one thing, and then amongst Muslims, it may mean different things, right? But then for a non-Muslim looking in, Muslim has a different connotation as well. It means something totally different. So when they talk about Muslim, it's not necessarily what we mean when we talk about Muslim. You see, and this happens in theology, happens in philosophy, happens in a lot of different areas. And so, for instance, when we get into the disagreements between the Mu'tazila and the Asha'ira Maturidiyya in theological circles, that one of the fundamental differences between those factions, or let's say between the Maturidis, or let's say the Sunni group theologians and the Mu'tazili theologians, has a lot to do with how you define what is an essential attribute of the Creator, what is a performative or active attribute of the Creator, because they define them in different ways, you see. So one group would say, well, this is an attribute of Allah, another would say, no, it's not an attribute of Allah. But at times, people are talking past one another because they're not taking into consideration that, well, your definition, we're actually differing in how we define the two terms, but in reality, if we knew from the start that we actually simply are defining them in different ways, then we probably wouldn't have spent all this time arguing for days or for years or for decades, sometimes for centuries, right? So sometimes it's a semantical point of disagreement, and sometimes there's substantive disagreements between different factions, right? And this is one thing that's going to come out even amongst the Sunni faction, that even in a lot of these particular terms, there's a disagreement about the definitions of those particular terms. So I said before that often outrage is expressed by people on the level of association. So for instance, we often don't object to definitions because we typically assume that everyone involved has the same definition. We express outrage to the association that are made with the particular categories. So for instance, if we say something about white people, or say something about black people, or say something about Arabs, you understand that we're outraged about those associations. But at the same time, that we often have to challenge even the definition, because the definition is supposed to be a particular term which takes into consideration all of the essential and accidental properties of the particular that falls under that general or universal category. And so if we make a mistake about the definition, which often happens in particular in the area of like race taxonomy, just in general, said this person is black, right? For instance, well, in America that means something, in Brazil it means something different. You see, in America we got one drop rule, right? And then in Brazil it's like you got the one drop rule as well, but it's in the opposite direction, right? So here you have one, or it said one drop, but the idea that you have any African blood, you're black. In Brazil, you have any European blood, you're no longer black, right? So you have, context itself. So said on the level of definition, sometimes we are often at odds with one another, and we make these assumptions. It's like, well, you're supposed to be be in solidarity with me because we're both black, and the other person, no, not really, because you got a different history than I do. That my context and my perceptions of reality are different from yours because we haven't had the same experiences. At any rate, those are important points to take into consideration. So this section, al-mujmal wal-mubayyan, concerning the summary and the detailed, or we can say the polyvocal and the clarified. So some expressions are polyvocal, meaning they're open to more than one interpretation, more than one meaning, without any preponderance given to one meaning over another. And then you have those same expressions which are clarified in one way, or sometimes they clarify in the same sentence, sometimes they're clarified by sentences that appear in other parts of the Quran, for instance, or of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Anwar, you had a question? Yes. Yes, semantics. Yeah, semantics. Yeah, I mean, when you actually, fundamentally, when the definitions are different, the same term, different definition, so it becomes semantical, or sometimes people utilize semantical just simply as a reference to, they say, well, basically, in essence, we're saying the same thing, but we're using different expressions, different words to express the same idea, but fundamentally it's the idea of, okay, our use of terms, they are a bit, they're not congruent. They're not congruent with one another. And so people will spend hours at a time. You get into a debate with the person for 3 hours, and then you say, "Oh man, that's what you were talking about." If you'd have said that from the beginning, we wouldn't have wasted three whole hours. Like the word sunnah is one of those examples. It's like you have Muslim says, "Well, you know that you don't have to do that. It's only sunnah," and the other person said, "Well, no, certain things of sunnah are compulsory." and it's like, well, how can that be? And so people get into these debates, have gotten to these debates when it's like one person is using the definition of sunnah according to the scholars of fiqh, some are using the definition of sunnah according to the scholars of usul of fiqh, some using the definition of sunnah according to the scholars of hadith, right? So different ways that they define the same term, you see. So it's just always important that in debates, that's one of the very first things you're always told to do, define your terms. Tahdid al-mafahim, you have to define your terms from the very start, because otherwise there's no point in debating. So we're going to debate about, for instance, does reason have greater authority than knowledge? For instance, something like that. You have to define what is reason, what you mean by reason. When you ilm, knowledge, what do you mean by knowledge? You have to have that discussion from the very beginning. And then once you get clarity, okay, now I understand what you mean by knowledge. When you say, and you can then say, well, I fundamentally disagree or I don't, right? So there's no need to argue, right? Or let's argue about it because we have the same definition. Okay? So, all right, good enough? Yeah, so Imam Amriti, he says in these first few lines, he says, ما كان محتاجا إلى بيان فمجمل وضابط البيان إخراجه من حالة الإشكال إلى التجلي واتضاح الحال. That which requires clarification is summary, and the criterion of clarification is removing it from a state of ambiguity to one of manifestness and clarity of condition. So basically what he did is he took one of the definitions of what is called bayan, which is a term which is utilized to refer to the removal of obscurity from obscure expressions. And so it's إخراجه من حالة الإشكال إلى حالة التجلي. As one scholar, he defined it, or Imam al-Juwayni himself defined it, offered that particular definition in his original work. So it is to take it out of the realm of the problematic or obscurity into the realm of the manifest and clear. And so for instance, and he actually, it's sort of me giving the examples, he actually mentions the examples afterwards, So the idea, so he began by defining al-bayan, clarification. What does it mean? The removal of obscurity. What does it mean? It means to remove something or a word from the sphere of obscurity into the sphere of manifestness or clarity. And so he gives this example, كالقرء وهو واحد الأقراء في الحيض والطهر من النساء. Like qur, or the qar. Like the qur, and it is the singular of al-aqra, which relates to menstruation and purity for women. Now, the reason he mentions this example, and this is a classic example of what we call lafzun mujmal, an obscure or polyvocal term. And that is because al-qar or al-qur is a word which it is a reference to female cycles, right? It's a reference to female cycles. So in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء. That divorced women are to wait for 3 quru, for 3 periods, right? So this is talking about divorced women who are to wait. So for instance, when the man, pronounces divorce, his wife, then the woman has to wait. We know that there's 3 cycles, but when does the cycle end? When is it over? When is that woman technically considered to be divorced from her husband? Is it at the start of the third menstrual cycle or at the end of the third menstrual cycle, right? And so according to some linguists, qar is a reference to tuhr, the actual period when a woman is not menstruating, and then the other says, hey, it is while a woman is menstruating. And that in itself leads to different judgments, legal judgments about divorce. So when is the woman technically divorced from her husband? And you find some take to one view, some take the other. For instance, the Hanafi's view, meaning that once the last menstrual cycle ends, whereas the Hanafi and Hanbali school, and then the Shafi'i and Maliki school being that is when the third period prior to the cycle expires. And so in that case, the woman will be divorced once the cycle begins. The other case, the woman will be divorced after the cycle is over. The bleeding actually stops. Right, so that's an example. Hadith is a lafz mujmal, a polyvocal term. And other examples of this are like, for instance, this is a common error, I think, that occurs when you ask people. If I ask you, those who study Arabic, what the word ayn means, what is ayn? What does it mean? Huh? Say again? Devil eyes? Oh, I think it's the evil eye. Yeah. Well, it definitely is utilized for that. The evil eye is ayn. And aynu haq is a hadith. The evil eye or the eye is real. Right? What are other things I heard there? It means what else? Spring. Yeah, but I'm saying, but if you hear it, if you just hear it, ayn, they think eye, right? Right, okay. That's the average person. Says eye, that's what it means. The Arabs in the time of the revelation of the Quran, ayn was a polyvocal term, meaning that it didn't have an apparent meaning without context. That it was just a word, right? And we only would know how it was being used exactly until it was put into a sentence, right? So if the Prophet said "Aynu haq," they're like, they understand something from the ma'hud, from what's familiar to them, what is meant by the ayn in that case. That sometimes ayn means a spring, and ayn is currency. Ayn is the evil eye. Ayn al-basira, with the normal eye of the body. There are a number of different. Ayn itself is a spy, right? Eye is a spy. It's utilized that way as well. Jasus. So you have many different usages for the word. However, so like, even though people today think it is a word whose original meaning is the eye of one's head, that the early Arabs, or at least what indications are that the Arabs at the time of revelation understood that word in a different way, that it was a word that didn't have any specific apparent or pseudo-explicit connotation, outside of a sentence. So it had to be utilized. Said, what's ayn? Well, use it in a sentence, I'll tell you. So that's where it was. So this actually shows us as well how language evolves based upon culture. And so you have to take into consideration when you're trying to interpret a particular text from the past, you have to take into consideration whether or not your current understanding of those words are equal to the understanding of the people to whom that particular scripture was revealed to, so that we don't impose our understandings on the past. Right? It is an important aspect of reading old texts or medieval texts or classical texts in general, or just any context realistically, because like a term in one science is not the same as another. The word mansub, right? And in basic language, like to be erected or something like that, and grammar has a different connotation, marfu', and grammar is one thing, and science of hadith, it means something different. You see, mashhur, same thing. So you have these different terms, so that's with regard to different disciplines or specialties. But even with regard to the time periods where we're living, and so the nature of language is that it does evolve, and so the job of one of the jobs of the lexicographer is to try to document those alterations or revolutions in the use of language. So like a new dictionary comes out, you'll find that a new meaning is attached to a particular word because it's being used in a different fashion. But we always, again, when we're reading the different texts, we have to be very sensitive to how the actual writer understands those particular terms if we want to get some level of accuracy about that. So that's an example. Wajh is another one. Wajh. What is wajh? Face, right? Again, during that time, it was a polyvocal term that was only known, the true meaning was only known on the basis of how it was used in the sentence, right? Today, Arab is like, hey, oh, yeah, face, ayn, yeah, eye, of course, it means eye. But when you read in the Quran, we can't make those assumptions. We can't just say, oh, face, or we can't just say eye right away. We have to read the context, and then that will help us to gain some clarity, inshallah. And then he says, وَالنَّصُّ عُرْفًا كُلُّ لَفْظٍ وَارِيدِ لَمْ يَحْتَمِلْ إِلَّا لِمَعْنًا وَاحِدٍ. The unambiguous term in general usage is every word which occurs and does not accept more than one meaning. Right, so he began with the mujmal, which we say polyvocal, and then now he was called nuss, which is, we can say univocal. So univocal term, and this is according to the overwhelming majority of linguists and legal theorists. The Hanafis have different definitions to this term. And so the Hanafis, they don't understand it exactly in the same way that the majority of the Sunni schools actually understand those terms. So you have to be very cognizant of that as well. So you're reading the Hanafi text, and they use the term nuss, and you think, okay, this is what Imam Juwayni said about it. You have to be very careful. That's not what the Hanafis mean by it. And so the Hanafis typically mean by a nuss, an expression which is nuss, or what the majority calls univocal or unambiguous. It means a particular expression that whose original intent is clear without needing any further clarification. An example of that would be this. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he speaks about riba. And so after a statement which is attributed to people who are trying to justify the imposition of usury or interest on loans, they say إِنَّمَا الْبَيْءُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَا, that trade is just like usury. There's no difference between general business and usury. But then after that, Allah says, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْءَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا, that Allah, he made business or trade lawful, but he made usury unlawful or interest unlawful. Now, this part of the verse, as I say, Allah made this lawful and that unlawful, that the original intent of it was to make a distinction between al-bay' wa riba. Right? Because the people, they said that, there's no difference between this or that. So the Hanafi would say, what is nuss about that expression, this expression of wa ahallallahu al-bay' wa harrama al-riba, nuss is that it is the difference between the two. There is a difference between the two. So that was the original intent. So they say this is nuss. You understand? So that's what the Hanafi. So it's a bit more difficult to actually, follow. It's a bit more complicated, with the Hanafi definition. But we do have to understand that they're not saying the same thing as the majority are saying. The majority, they're just saying they're focusing on a single expression, a single word that said this particular word is nuss. This word is open to only one meaning. That's it can only mean one thing. Like, for instance, if I say thalatha, 3, right? Of course, there are certain times, when we find numbers, which you use them in a metaphorical sense. But generally, like in the verse, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوءٍ, divorced women are to wait by themselves for 3 quru'. So 3 is nuss. It doesn't mean 4, doesn't mean 5, doesn't mean 10, doesn't mean 100, right? It means 3, right? It can only mean that, right? Quru' is mujmal, right? It's polyvocal, right? It can, right? We know it, what we do know about it, we know it has something to do with women's cycles, but in the context of divorce, does it mean that the divorce is over before, at the moment that the cycle, the bleeding begins, or when the bleeding is over? So that's, in that aspect, it is polyvocal. And so then he goes when he says, قَدْ رَأَيْتُ جَعْفَرًا وَقِيلَ مَا تَأْوِيلُهُ تَنْزِيلُهُ فَلْيُعْلَمَ. So he said, like saying, so an example of nuss, he says, like saying, I saw Ja'far, رَأَيْتُ جَعْفَرًا. So he's saying that Ja'far, in that sentence, I saw Ja'far, Ja'far is nuss. Right? So, of course, with the condition that we know who Ja'far is. Right? We know exactly who Ja'far is. Yes, it's nuss. I saw Ja'far. Between us, we know who Ja'far is. So long as we know who Ja'far is, that's nuss. It's unequivocal. It's and also as long as there are no other people by the name of Ja'far that we both know. Right? And it was funny. I was having a conversation with Dawood Yassin earlier the week, and he had mentioned something about, he said Faraz Khan. And he had a conversation with Faraz Khan, and he had lunch with him, and I was thinking he was talking about Ustad Faraz Khan, but he was talking about Faraz Khan, who's the architect here, the architect. I was like, oh, okay. The whole time I'm thinking he's talking about Ustad Faraz Khan, and he's talking about. It wasn't until the end I said, oh, that's who you're talking about. So you can have some confusion at times. But if there's only one Faraz Khan in our lives, then it's nuss. Otherwise, it's mujmal, right? In this case, it was mujmal. He said, yeah, I sat with Faraz Khan, it's mujmal. Right? So there needs bayan. Somebody has to give us some bayan. Yeah, which Faraz Khan are you talking about? Yeah, like saying I saw Ja'far, and it was said that its interpretation is identical to its outer wording, let it be known. Or a better way to, I would say, translate this, because fundamentally what the author is doing is offering a second definition to nuss, which is ma ta'wiluhu tanziluhu. It is said that expression whose interpretation or understanding is the actual revelation of it. That's the revelation of it. So for instance, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if you commit this sin, then you do this, right? فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ. For instance, whoever doesn't find this thing, then fast 3 days, right? So fast 3 days, that expression, fast 3 days is nuss. That's one definition offered as well. And as if that is somewhat of an allusion to the Hanafi definition as well. So the translation needs a little work right there. وَظَاهِرُ الَّذِي يُفِيدُ مَا سُمِعَ مَعْنًا سِوَى الْمَعْنَى الَّذِي لَهُ وُضِعَ. And the apparent is that which, when it is heard, conveys a meaning other than that for which it was established. So we have mujmal, which we call I would call polyvocal. Some say apparent. Say nuss, which is the unambiguous or the univocal. And then a third expression, al-zahir, which here I like to call pseudo-explicit. That this is a word which in its origin takes on more than one meaning, has more than one meaning. It's polyvocal, but one of those particular meanings stands out. Like when you hear it, it's like for instance, ayn for people today is, living today and wajh today is zahir, right? Meaning that it's a pseudo-explicit word. When you hear it, it's like, oh, I think face. I think I. Even though those shouldn't fall in that category in the context of interpreting the revelation. But an example of a true zahir, lafzun zahir, is the word yad. We dealt with this before, the word hand. And so the zahir or the pseudo-explicit understanding of hand is yad, is hand or arm. It can be arm as well. Is this the jariha, the extremity of the body that we are familiar with? But hand can also mean ihsan, goodwill. It can be a tasarruf, sort of dibbling or meddling in something. It can be sultan, sort of authority, quwwah, power. A lot of different other meanings for the word hand. So when we read a verse of the Quran and we find the word hand mentioned in it, yadullahi fawqa aydihim, Allah's hand is over there, their hands, right? Then there's the possibility that it could be literally mean hand, right? Or figuratively. Now, some would say, well, no, it couldn't possibly literally mean hand because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, laysa kamithlihi shay, there's nothing like unto him, right? Lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad, right? So we have, la tatribu lillahi al-amthal, do not strike similitudes for God. So we have those principles in the Quran that pretty much tell us that anytime we find something mentioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which resembles a characteristic of the creation, then we are to not assume it to be like that of the creation. right? That it is something else. And as I say, in other words, it will be something, a metaphor, or because some people don't like to refer to those as metaphors, or they say that it is an expression which refers back to a true attribute of God, one of God's true attributes, right? Such as his qudra, was quwwah, things like that, or ni'mah, like blessing, because that's also one of the meanings of hand. Or you don't have to even indulge with those possibilities. You could just simply say, hey, well, God said it, and that's all. I'll just pass over it. I just know that it's not what I'm familiar with. I know that. And this is why Imam Shafi'i is quoted as saying about these type of expressions in verses that are directly a reference to Allah. He said, Amantu billah wa bima ja'a anillahi ala muradillah. That I believe in Allah and what has come about Allah according to the intent of Allah. Right. So whatever Allah meant by the expression, that's what I believe in. And that in itself implies an interpretation or the rejection of the literal connotation of it, but it's just not assigning a new meaning, an alternate meaning to the word itself. But that's an example of zahir. We call it kalima zahira. And so you have mujmal, nuss, and zahir. The three basic categories, but there are other categories that have been mentioned. And as I mentioned before, the Hanafis have their own sort of like list of terminology, zahir, nuss, mufassar, muh'kam, and then they have khafi, al-mushkil, al-mutashabih. So they have their own list of categories, which of course it's not enough time to really get into examples of all of those, but it's just to understand that if you're reading a Hanafi book and you see these terms, they have a different connotation than they do if you're reading a book from Shafi'i, a Maliki, or from a Hanbali. And so then he says, كالأسد اسم واحد السباع وقد يرى للرجل الشجاع. Like the lion, a name for the one of the beast, but which sometimes is used for a brave man. Like if I say Yusuf Asad, right? Yusuf is a lion, right? Now what does that mean? Now of course, literally we know it literally can't mean that, but we know it's a metaphor. But Yusuf is like a lion in what fashion, in what way? Right? It has to be according to a particular characteristic for which a lion is most well known for, right? As opposed to like for instance, of course you're not going to say, well, Yusuf is like a lion in terms of the smell of his breath, right? Right? Because that's not, when we say he's a lion, that's not one of the prominent sort of characteristics that we attribute to the lion. We think of a lion as a very courageous animal, the king of the jungle, right? That he's a lion, meaning so in his courage, he's like a lion, right? So the word asad, right, is ismu zahir. When I say asad to you, that the first thing comes to mind is what? This animal, this predator, right? Predatory animal, right? Lives in the jungle, right? He's the king of the jungle. But the context will change the meaning of it, or the sentence that I utilize will now change the meaning of it, because Yusuf can't literally be a lion. Can't be. Well, I know because he's a human being. He's a man. I know that. He's a haywan, but he's not muftaris like the lion. He doesn't have, these claws, and you understand? So here's an example of zahir. وَالظَّاهِرُ الْمَذْكُورُ حَيْثُ أَشْكَالَ مَفْهُومُهُ فَبِالدَّلِيلِ أَوَّلًا. And the apparent, when its meaning becomes problematic, is to be interpreted by means of a proof. That is to say that if anytime a word has an original connotation, like yad or like asad, for instance, then, but it also is possible to be utilized in metaphorical fashion, that the basic rule is that you don't just simply interpret it in a metaphorical fashion without a justification. There has to be evidence that you need to. You understand? Like for instance, there are a lot of people who read the hadith of the Antichrist, the Masih al-Dajjal. And people automatically, they say, oh, it was all a metaphor. But there are a number of hadiths which actually describe the family of that individual, his parents, what they look like. His mother's extremely fat, and his father is, has a very long nose, pointy nose, and, and how old they were when he was born, and you understand, and written on his head are these letters, and so you find that, and there's no reason for us not to imagine, or not to accept that the Antichrist or the Dajjal will be a man, or is a man, right? And actually, as a person, right? Human being who with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala endows with certain powers as a trial for humanity. And so unless we have good reason not to take those literally, then we continue to understand them in their original fashion according to these rules. And there's a qaida, a maxim that says that asl fil kalam al-haqiqa, that the presumption is to be, predominance is to be given to the literal meaning according to the basic premises. Or we start off, the principle is that we adopt the original meaning of words unless there's evidence to the contrary. وصار بعد ذلك التأويل مقيدا في الاسم بالدليل. And after this interpretation, it becomes qualified in its name by means of a proof. So this is when the zahir word is being utilized in this less preferred or less directly understood connotation, then the scholars call it zahir bid-dalil. That is zahir by way of proof. It has a departure from its norm to its secondary or tertiary or whatever beyond that meaning, or they simply call it mu'awwal. Zahir, if it's taken literally, we call it zahir. If it's taken figuratively, we call it mu'awwal. And this is where we get the word ta'wil, right? The word ta'wil comes from, right? We know that word. We've heard that before. Ta'wil. Who doesn't know ta'wil? Never heard that? Yeah. So ta'wil, we know tafsir, right? Tafsir. So tafsir, we just say Quranic exegesis, right? This is, and so the difference between the two terms is that the tafsir is an example of tafsir would be when I'm trying to describe or looking for a synonym to a particular word in, for instance, the Arabic language. So, for instance, we live in a certain time, and the people's understanding of language has grown very weak. A scholar in the tafsir book will say, for instance, if we're reading Al-Fatiha, Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, they'll say Sirat al-Tariq, right? This tafsir, they are familiar with tariq, so Sirat is tariq, that's what it is, right? And so that's an example of tafsir. Ta'wil, example of tafsir would be when we're actually taking the word beyond its original sort of linguistic meaning and choosing its alternate meaning. So, for instance, then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُخْرِجُ الْحَيَّ مِنَ الْمَيِّتِ وَيُخْرِجُ الْمَيِّتَ مِنَ الْحَيِّ. Allah, He brings the living out of the dead and the dead out of the living. Right? So bring the living out of the dead. Now, a tafsir would be, Allah, He brings forth a chicken out of it, the chick egg. The chick, comes out of the egg, right? Brings the, living out of the dead, right? Come from an egg, it's dead, right? And then life comes from it. But an example of a ta'wil would be that bringing the kafir into iman, right? That He brings, there's a person who rejects faith in Allah, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enlivens that person's heart, illuminates that person's heart with iman, with faith, right? So brings the dead, living out of the dead, right? And then the opposite could occur as well. Right, and so in one particular verse, before I conclude and then open things up, that is important in this particular section is verse 6 from Surah Ali Imran. Because even though Usul al-Fiqh is focused on praxis, focused on law, that since this course is a little bit broader than that, it's more about just issue why people disagree about many different things. There's one verse 6 from Surah Al Imran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخرى متشابهات. That it is He who revealed to you the book. From it are verses which are muhkamat, which are clear, they're decisive, univocal, they're unambiguous, وأخرى متشابهات, and others that are mutashabihat, which for the majority mutashabihat is that is to say that these are verses whose meaning ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. So some majority say mutashabih is synonymous with mujmal, in that it is an obscure type of verse, a verse that contains obscure words or expressions in them, and they require clarification. So if there's a way to determine or to discover the clarification of the meanings of those verses, then we call the expression mujmal, according to the majority. But if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who has to give the clarification himself through revelation or speaking directly to one of us, then we say the verse is mutashabih. So it remains that way. So for instance, an example of mutashabih in the Quran are we call huruf al-muqatta'at, the severed letters, right, or the abbreviated letters at the beginning of a number of surahs. Alif Lam Mim, Alif Lam Ra, Noon, Sad. We have all throughout the Quran. So the question of what do they mean? Why did Allah use them, mention these? We really don't know. They're mutashabihats, right? And so fundamentally that is so mutashabihat. There are some which are allegorical, right, which only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can clarify, and then there are others which are we can actually discern some degree of their meaning through the language itself. So the verse says, we reveal to you the book. From them are those that are clear. They are the foundation of the book. Hunna umul kitab. They are the foundation of the book. وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَات, and others that are mutashabihat. Some others that are ambiguous or allegorical. فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ ابْتِغَاءَ الْفِتْنَةِ وَابْتِغَاءَ تَأْوِيلِهِ. And as for those who have perversion in their hearts, they follow the part thereof which is ambiguous or allegorical. ابتغاء الفتنة, seeking discord, وابتغاء تأويله, and seeking its meaning. وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله, and none know its meaning except for Allah. والراسخون في العلم يقولون آمنا به كل من عند ربنا. And those who are deeply grounded in knowledge, they say, we believe in it, all is from our Lord. And so this particular verse has been a subject of great controversy throughout Islamic history between the different theological schools, both the Sunni and non-Sunni schools. Even though most theological schools, both the Sunni and Shia, have been less anthropomorphic, is that the synonym, anthropomorphism? Is anthropomorphic, right? Okay. Less anthropomorphic, or they say less inclined to describe Allah with corporeal characteristics, right? Human characteristics, among other things. That the Hanbali school, on the other hand, and those who typically took under the banner we call the Ahlul Ra'i, Ahlul Hadith, were of a different view. That their position was totally different in that listen, if Allah said He has it, He has it. We just say that we just don't know what it looks like. That He is real. If Allah says hands, it's real. If He has face, it's real. If He says foot in the Hadith, it's real. But we just don't know what it looks like. You see, it's real. Where the majority say, well, no. If you say it's real, then you're saying it's literal. And if you're saying it's literal, then it's saying it's just like exactly what we have. You see. And now that the root of that disagreement somewhat goes back to it's a very deep philosophical foundation for that disagreement, and it relates to the question of whether or not whether it relates to the question of how much authority should be given to reason, right? Or if reason should have any authority at all, especially with regard to the Islamic teachings, where the Ahl Hadith, the traditionists or traditionalists, they themselves have historically been opposed to this idea. So, for instance, the appropriation of other intellectual trends of other civilizations, like the Greeks. Like the Sunnis and the Shia are very much indebted to the Greek tradition. And so, for instance, we talk about the liberal arts here, Zaytuna, right? That the Greek tradition is extremely important to Islamic orthodoxy, at least for the majority of the both the Sunnis and the Shia, and that, for instance, we appropriate logic is important, syllogism, the concept of definition, all those different things, appropriated from the Greeks, and then become a significant part of Islamic theological imagination. However, the anti-rationalist position of the traditionalists was that, well, listen, that if we ourselves are to claim that Islam is sufficient for humanity, then there's no need for us to appropriate, something from another tradition, because otherwise, at what point do we know that what the teachings that we are offering to people are from Islam or not, or from something somewhere else? Islam is the deen itself, so there is some worth there. And so for instance, one of the most famous scholars from the Hanbali school, Ibn Taymiyyah, was very intelligent, highly intelligent individual who he questioned, the concept of definition. He questioned the concept of syllogism. He questioned the universal, the concept of universal. And for this reason, some said that, referred to him as a nominalist, that individual basically, doesn't accept universal categories, even though that I don't believe that that's really a very fair characterization of him, because he clearly accepts universal categories in areas of law. But when it comes to the matter of theology, and in particular with regard to describing God, that he problematizes the issues in such a way where it sort of takes the wind out of his opponents to a certain extent, because when you don't accept your opponent's premises, then it's easier for you to establish a counter narrative, you see. And this is probably one of the major reasons why many of those in the Sunni tradition have very anti-Ibn Taymiyyah, have very negative opinions about him, and also because of his certain opinions he has about Sufism. And so, but it's important just to understand that there's different paradigms that people are dealing with. And so Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, he had his own definition of zahir, right, as well, right? So he didn't accept the concept of ta'wil, of sort of the figurative interpretation. He didn't accept it in word, but in practice he totally did. But he just refused to call these things ta'wil. So for instance, if a word was being applied in this non-original fashion, then he would say that's not a ta'wil. That's zahirul lafz. That is the apparent meaning of the expression. Right. So he would do that. He would raise objection, because if he said it was ta'wil, then he would have to yield to his opponents and say that, surrender that, that figurative speech does exist in the Quran, right? And if figurative speech does exist in the Quran, then these expressions are open to be taken as figurative expressions, when Allah says Allah's hands over their hands, God's face, among other things, that they're figurative expressions. They're not literal expressions. So Ibn Taymiyyah said, no, they're real. They refer to something real. They're attributes of God, and we just don't know what they look like, pretty much. And so that was a source of disagreement between them. But it started on the level of definition, you see. And it also got into the issue of their epistemology. What is aql? Does reason have authority, or does not? Ibn Taymiyyah, no, it does not. It does not have the authority that you want to give to it, you see. But if I surrender that reason does have that authority, and of course he actually does imply that reason does have authority, because he's arguing on the basis of rational arguments. But it's his positions are a little bit more nuanced than that. At any rate, I hope that there was some benefit, a lot of benefit that comes from that. But again, this is another one of those sources of disagreement that people have, and we always have to be very aware of it. So when we have a disagreement with people, it's like we ask them, okay, well, is it that you don't believe, for instance, that the Prophet ﷺ said that, or is it because the expression is ambiguous? You believe that something's been abrogated by something else, or are we having a disagreement about definition? Right? We just differ about the way we define different things, and that's always important to take into consideration when we start to debate or argue with people. We can't always assume that everybody agrees with the same have the same assumptions about different things, and if we do, then we can get ourselves into very unnecessary debates with people. All right. So sallallahu alaihi wasallam Muhammad alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So if there are any questions, then I'll open things up.
We
Yes.
have a question online. One of the questions online are the terms mubayyan and nuss synonymous in this context.
No, a mubayyan and nuss are not synonymous. Mubayyan is the term which is utilized to refer to an obscure expression which has achieved or found clarification in another place, right? So if the expression is, for instance, mujmal, which is polyvocal, it's open to many different possibilities, but we really don't know which one is appropriate in this particular instance. But then we find a separate expression that actually gives us clarity. Then we say that this lafz is no longer mujmal, now it is mubayyan. And a basic rule of ijmal or obscurity, obscure expressions in legal philosophy or Islamic jurisprudence is that لا يجوز تأخير البيان عن وقت الحاجة. That is, it is not permissible to delay clarification beyond the time of need. That is to say, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says we have to do something, but the type of wording He utilizes when He orders us to do it is an expression which can be taken more than one way, then it is Allah's obligation or His Messenger's obligation to give us clarification about that, you see. Or what the fuqaha have said is to say that the clarification exists, but these are areas where we are expected to search for the clarification, because if He told us to do something, then there has to be clarification somewhere. But with regard to the other types of, like the ambiguous terms or words, like in the mutashabihat, the allegorical, so in those cases, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't necessarily expect from us anything, right? So in those areas, we don't need to even do research, right? The idea of, the different letters, what Allah means when He swears about certain things, and then some even say these verses that give the impression that Allah resembles the creation. That said, they fall in those categories. That listen, we don't even need to even look into that. This is be like Imam Shafi'i. I believe in Allah and what has come about Allah according to the intent of Allah, and that is sufficient. They call it tafweed al-ma'ani. Yeah, the question? Yes. The nasikh and mansukh, the abrogating and abrogated verses of the Quran. The question was like, would we place them in the category of the mutashabihat? Not in the original sense that is, the term mutashabih is typically a reference to ambiguity about the meaning of a particular word in a particular verse. Whereas when we talk about nasikh and mansukh, abrogating and abrogated, we're talking about the actual effect of the judgments mentioned in a particular verse, right? So if I say something is abrogated, I'm talking about the judgment itself, which is supposed to be applied in our lives, is no longer obligatory for us to apply, right? Or it is now obligatory for us to apply when in fact before it was not. So there are two different regards we're talking about, two different regards we're dealing with that. Now, interestingly, for the Hanafis, when their distinction between the muh'kam and mutashabih, there is an element of the conversation of abrogation involved here. So a verse which is muh'kam is one which is not, and there's more to the definition, but part of the definition is that it's one which is not subject to abrogation, right? It is not subject to abrogation ever. It's an immutable injunction, right? It's a muh'kam. Like, for instance, an example often mentioned is al-jihadu madan ila yawm al-qiyamah. I'm sure I'm scared. I heard jihad, right? You get scared. But it's a hadith. Jihad is effective until the day of resurrection, right? That's an example they mentioned. They say it's a muh'kam that is effective, meaning that, that that we always have an obligation to fight against injustice, and there's no way that's an immutable judgment. It's always going to be the case, that for us to have to fight against ourselves or fight against injustice in society, among other things. So for the Hanafis, it definitely would have a connection with the abrogated verses. Now, another way you can look at this as well is that when we take into consideration the very fact that there's a lot of disagreement about how many verses of the Quran actually are abrogated, right? That definitely there's a certain degree of tashabuh involved here, so in that, or ishtibah, and that it's hard to know how many exactly, because there's been a lot of discussion. There's one book that was written by a scholar that said, La naskha fil Quran. There's no abrogation in the Quran at all. But he was really talking about another issue is connected with Judaism and Christianity. So Islam sort of abrogates those. And he might have been speaking about other things as well. I never finished the entire book. But there are some who claim that no verses are abrogated. Rather, most claims or all claims of abrogation realistically is just simply examples of general statements being taken specifically, or that by other verses they specify them. And so there really wasn't, and this is acknowledged by all the scholars realistically, that there's a lot of occurrences of this, where some scholars would claim one verse is abrogated by another, and all it is fundamentally is an example of one particular verse as am and the other is khas. Right? So one is a general statement and the other is specific, and so the am yuhmalu ala khas, so the general statement is to be interpreted according to the specific, or mutlaq al muqayyid, the yuhmalu mutlaqu al muqayyid, that the absolute unqualified should be interpreted according to the qualified. So you have a lot of those type of examples in the claims of abrogation. But there's a lot of disagreement there. So in that area, in terms of the area of disagreement, yes, mutashabih. We really don't know. And the hadith of the Prophet too. Another example of that is in the Quran unzila ala sab'ati ahruf, that the Quran was revealed upon 7 ahruf, 7 letters or 7 variations. That hadith is a hadith mutashabih by consensus of the scholars. That really don't know what the Prophet meant by that. Right. What we do know is just it was something that connected, or put like that, we don't know for certain what the Prophet ﷺ meant by that. And so we do know it had some connection with the early period of Muslims, wherein a type of ease was involved with their learning of the Quran. That's all we know, that it's connected there. But exactly, it's up to about 40 opinions about exactly what's meant by that hadith. You see, so the hadith itself is mutashabih as well. And the hadith is not a reference to the 7 qira'at. There's a difference. So people make that mistake. The hadith of that the Quran was revealed upon 7 variants or 7 letters or words, or however we were able to translate it. It's not the same as the argument about we call it the 7 qira'at. The 7 qira'at became confused with the hadith once a scholar known as Ibn Mujahid wrote his book, and he specified that he was writing about 7 qira'ats, and then from that time people started to confuse the hadith with the idea or the concept of the 7 variant readings of the Quran, or modes of recitation of the Quran. Rahban, yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. For the majority, muh'kam is synonymous with nuss, which is univocal. That is a term or which is not open to more than one meaning. Is open. Right. Exactly. Yeah. But the Hanafis have a different definition. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. What, in terms of interpreting verses according to different contexts, is there a level of tashabuh or ambiguity involved with that? Yeah, of course. I mean, there's always a level of ambiguity, because even the idea that you have to interpret verses in certain contexts, that's not universally agreed upon as well. Because, like, for instance, it's a little bit controversial, but the verse that mentions وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ, and men have a grade over them, that some scholars would say that is a totally new sentence. It's independent of what comes before it, right? So they say that men have a grade over women, right? That they're, you understand. So when in fact, it's in the context of divorce وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, and they have in their favor the like of what is against them, according to fair terms. وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ, and men have a degree over them, right? In terms of divorce, so the men can sort of unilaterally sort of end the relationship, but women generally cannot, right? So basically, that's the context. But there's some scholars who say, no, this is independent. It's a totally new sentence. Jumla musta'nafa. It's a starts a new thought altogether. So it's something. It's taken as universal. So and that can be extremely problematic. Especially when we have a hyper-deferential opinion about the classical scholarship, to the point that, like, for instance, say, well, we accept all the four schools and we believe that everything is good, right? Everything's all good in there, so as long as it comes from four schools, it's okay. We don't object against it. Well, I'm not totally sure if that's the best way to approach things, or even if that in itself is a very sound criterion for determining what is moral, what's immoral, what's correct, what's incorrect. You see, so we do have to be somewhat critical at times, and be willing to disagree with some classical interpretation. Especially when we know that it is an interpretation, right? So when we start saying that we're supposed to that we should follow the ijtihad of the scholars, we're talking about in fiqh, right? We're not necessarily talking about in theology. We're not talking about just in general opinions about things, you see. So, but what's happened, unfortunately, that there's a lot of opinions that exist that have been passed down that had nothing to do with praxis, and then we say, well, okay, that's what we're supposed to be believing about these type of people, about those type of people. You understand? And we start to make these associations, negative associations and stereotypes with certain people. Because it's really, seriously, if I were to mention to you a lot of things, especially for people who have a hyper-deferential position or opinion of the traditional scholars, right, to the extent there's like this idea that, okay, well, their intentions were so pure that they could never, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sort of like He spoke through them. And you understand, there's some people who actually think of the scholars in that fashion. And we definitely would say that, yes, majority, alhamdulillah, that they're, steered themselves free of a lot of these different things. But we have to maintain that there's a distinction between the prophets and the scholars, right? Because the scholars are the heirs of the prophets, but they're not prophets, And so, but not being the prophet, then you're still subject to certain to be influenced by your own culture, by your own biases. That ego can play a part. And we have a lot of records of feuds, historical feuds between scholars. So people have. Still people, so we respect the knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to trust their hearts as well, right? You understand? There's certain people whose hearts you trust, but that comes through experience, you see, your interaction with them. Then you learn to trust their hearts as well. It's hard to trust the heart of a person you've never met, you see. Yes. Yeah. Right. The criterion that is generally assumed to be utilized to determine whether a term is polyvocal or univocal or pseudo-explicit is fundamentally just a study of the language history itself, language history, the linguistics. That they're looking at poetry, they're looking at of course, the eloquence of the Quran itself, which is the epitome of Arabic eloquence, and so they try to extract from a lot of these sources, these historical sources, what original connotations or words, what their meanings are, So mujmal, nuss, and zahir are just terms, we'll call this type this. So it's just they're choosing a particular word to describe those particular realities that already existed. So yes, Anwar. Any sisters over? No, okay. Anwar. It's okay. That's what we're here for. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, well, again, if you go back to the definition, that you always start with the definition. When you say muh'kam, you always have to think about, okay, which definition am I talking about of muh'kam, right? So when you first determine the definition, then it'll be easier for you to answer the question, you see, right? So according to this definition, according to what they say about what muh'kam is, yes, you can identify this many of those, right? And see, the idea of the muh'kam is not based upon, it's not a matter of opinion, you see. It's not ideas. Like, it's kind of like mathematics. It's like, it's like, well, a scholar over here said 1 plus 1 equals 2. This other scholar says it equals 3. Say, well, who cares what that scholar said? That scholar is crazy, So he doesn't even deserve the name scholar, So it's a bit more of an objective type of process, So if there's disagreement about it, then it's clearly not muh'kam. You understand? But that's the very nature of it. If it's muh'kam, it's because it's clear. It's clear. No one of any real consideration disagrees with that particular judgment, that this is a univocal term. So if you're talking about, it's like Imam Juwayni is dealing with the definition of the majority of the scholars, and I just want to highlight that the Hanafis, when they talk about muh'kam, they mean something different, and that's extremely important if you start to study a Hanafi text. That's really the only point I was making. Continue. Go ahead. Tafadhal, zid. Yeah, definitely. Again, what scholars say doesn't mean anything. You understand? Yeah. At the end of the day, it's like if it's muh'kam, it's muh'kam. It doesn't matter how many scholars said it. Yeah. It's not determined by how many scholars said it. It's determined by the very nature of language itself. And the very fact that the Arabs themselves took it in that way. You see. So it's not based upon how many said it or how many didn't say it. It's based upon this is how they use their language. You see. So a scholar can come today and say, well, I disagree. I think that hand, has a different, it should mean this, or whatever. Or, you understand? So if the Arabs themselves, when they used the language, when they were communicating with one another, they meant something different than what this more modern person means by it, then we just ignore this modern person. I don't care what type of scholarship that person is known for, you see. Because when we're dealing with, and that's the same thing also as well with rational matters as well, the aqliyats, that the scholars say there's la ijma' fil aqliyat. There's no consensus in rational matters. You understand? So again, it's like 5 plus 5 equals 10. 5 times 5 equals 25. You understand? It's not. There's no basis for claiming there's a consensus that it's 25. No, it's 25 because when I count it, 1, 2, 3, 4. You understand? Now we can argue there's a consensus that we call it 25. You're right. We can talk about what we call it. But the actual reality itself has nothing to do with an agreement. You see, it's just that's what happened. That I dropped the ball and it falls down to the ground. There's consensus that gravity exists. No, gravity exists in spite of consensus. You understand? So, yes. Are there any groups that what? Amongst the Sunnis and the Shiites, to my knowledge, there are no groups who adopted there's no abrogation at all in the Quran. That the abrogation is a fundamental teaching of the Quran itself. So the claim that there's no abrogation at all of the Quran, is itself is very problematic from a historical standpoint, and actually from a Quranic standpoint too as well. So there's some modern people today, Muslims, who are claiming that, because there's some Muslims who just feel that abrogation, if you accept that something's been abrogated, and that itself weakens the authority of the Quran, and I personally don't agree with that. That we already accept abrogation of previous scriptures, of abrogation of the Bible. We accept that already. So why should it? That was revealed by Allah as well. So would that mean that it's something flawed with the Creator because he decided to change the law? He can change the law at will, even in the same book. You see, or he can change a law from being compulsory to recommended. You understand? From something being generally just lawful to disliked. That he has that authority to do so. He is the legislator. Lahu al-hukmu wal-amr. That his is the judgment and the command. So again, that's more of a recent issue that's been raised by certain Muslims, and I guess it's a challenge to certain people's faith because they want to present Islam in a single, uniform, very clear fashion to non-Muslims, with this belief that if non-Muslims get the pure message, if I present Islam to them like this, then there's no doubt they're going to become Muslim. Well, there's never any doubt that there's never any certainty that anybody's going to become Muslim because you present Islam to them in a certain way. You say, "Yo, that's a beautiful way you should present Islam." I have a friend who became Muslim. He was in college, and he was doing acid and things like that, and he was in the Arabic class, and a Muslim walks up to him and says, "Hey man, he's from Britain." He's like, "Hey, you wanna you become a Muslim?" And so he said he sat there and he thought about it. He said, "Well, I don't know much about that." Okay, let's do it. So he became Muslim that way, and he's one of the best Muslims I know today. He actually teaches, he knows Arabic, and he knows fiqh, he knows aqidah. He's a teacher in the UK right now. So on the other hand, I spent 3 hours talking to an atheist, a young atheist woman from Scotland when I was in Morocco one year, and on the train, and I felt that I'd never explained Islam as clearly to anyone before. They believe in God, and she kept acknowledging. She was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Oh yes, that makes sense. Oh yes, it makes sense. And then it came to the end, and I said, "What, you believe in God now?" She said, "No." And so we have to get out of this idea that we can come up with a formula that's going to guarantee that people are going to become Muslim. No, Allah guides whom He pleases. He misleads whom He pleases, and of course He doesn't mislead without justification. He sends people guidance, people reject, and eventually the doors just close on people. But we have to get out of this sort of the sense of I feel like at times often it's like this sense of wanting to be accepted by others. It's kind of like, okay, well, if they come like me, then it's easier. I can deal with it easier. And it's a fundamental problem of even extremists, extremist people. It's this idea that you believe different than I do, so I have to make you like me in order for me to feel comfortable. And if you don't, then I'm going to treat you, I'm going to be mean towards you. There are a lot of people who feel that way, and I think that this urge is kind of rooted in that person with a lot of people, not everybody. For some people it's a legitimate, I think it's a legitimate sort of issue that comes up. But I just think that the question of, does abrogation indicate that there's something flawed about the Quran? I just think that particular idea just in itself is flawed, and there's no really, where does it come from, and what makes it flawed? What makes it flawed? So why can't there be abrogation in the Quran of certain verses? In one verse, Allah talks about woman commits fornication, lock her away in the house until she dies, or until Allah makes a way for her. And then the other verse talks about those who commit fornication, you lash them 100 times. A way was been made for her. So that's an abrogation. One judgment, lock them away. Another judgment says, lash them 100 times, 100 stripes. So that was, an abrogation, clear abrogation in the Quran. So there's no way to deny that there's some abrogation. It's just that we don't know for certain how much abrogation really has occurred. And with that, we have to conclude. We're a little bit over time. But we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us clarity, grant us firmness in our understanding, in our iman, to be the one who takes us and illuminates our hearts and takes us by our hands and keeps us upon this path, grant us sincerity, to give us Jannah, because all this is all about. That's really what this is all about, is studying these things to create to place us on the path of Jannah, inshallah, because Islam is both a private and a public affair. And so we is about our personal well-being, but also the well-being of our societies, inshallah. So hopefully by gaining a deeper understanding of why we disagree, we can hopefully deal better with one another, and actually also make others aware of these type of issues, to wake them up as well. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا وسبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.